Welcome to Digital Crochet. I have seen that this was already talking a lot about graphs, so we're just going to continue with that. But now we're going to dive into a new domain, which is crochet, as you have already been introducing me. What is crochet? Maybe some of you don't know. I don't know. Does anybody know crochet? I don't know if you can like show hands here or something. That would be maybe interesting to know. Or say something. Yeah, I see in that video. Okay. I'm not sure if somebody showed their hands. Yeah, cool. So there seems to be somebody. In any case, so this is how it looks. The interesting thing that you should remember from this is that you always have one hook and yarn, obviously, because you're crocheting with yarn, and you're always inserting into something. So you're using the hook like a tool to you insert into a space of the yarn, and that's how you start a new stitch. That's how it's called. So you have stitches, and the stitches together make up the thing that you're crocheting, right? So we're going to talk about crochet patterns and the items that you're making from it. Just like a bit about the terminology, let's say. It's not overly complex, don't worry, but it is a domain for some, I suppose. So this is crochet. And let's have a look a little bit about, how do I go to the next slide now? Here. So when we look at different types of manual work, I mean, obviously there is also knitting. Probably many of you might even confuse knitting with crochet. It's actually quite different. So you have like two needles that then together work with yarn, or multiple needles, but always you're working with two needles. And in knitting, actually, you can see below this, like can you see my, I think you can see them. So in knitting, you have here the needles that you're working with, and you can represent that in a table. So that is kind of a simple, easy way to represent how to write a knitting pattern. And you probably know there is a lot of machines for knitting out there, and this just is because of the simple way of representing knitting, and also then being able to build that in a machine to actually make knitting automatically. The same thing can be said kind of with weaving. Weaving is a super simple technique where basically you go up and down, and the way that you go up and down between the lines of yarn defines your pattern, and this you can again represent in a table like you can see below. Crochet, on the other hand, is a lot more complex. You have only one hook, but that gives you the freedom of basically inserting literally anywhere. Like you don't always have like one specific spot where you can insert. It's like in weaving, you know you will have to come up eventually and eventually go back down between the lines of yarn. This is not the case in crochet. You really always have one point where you're ending, which is where the hook is. And then you can insert almost anywhere out of the crocheted item that you have. And what you see below this picture, so this is how it looks when you crochet. And below this is another way of a diagrammatic way of representing crochet. This is called crochet chart. You will hear this now a lot in this talk. So this is basically what I'm going to be working with as a base. And this is really interesting, as this is able to represent crochet in a visual way. So basically, it's trying to be like the other tables there, just that you cannot fit it really into a table format, because it's not that simple. It's way more complex, because you can make a lot of different shapes with this, which you can usually not do with knitting. Or when you try to make something different with knitting, you usually use a lot of parts that you then sew together. But in crochet, you can usually do this in one go, because you're so much more flexible. I hope that this makes sense so far. If not, I mean, anybody can ask questions. If not, I'm open to that. So basically, what we're seeing here is that there's a high level of complexity of crochet that also requires a high level of representation for this. So let's quickly have a look at how this works right now. So when we're going to talk also about designers, who are going to be the crochet designers, so the people who are actually thinking of what you might be able to crochet, and then writing down or drawing how you would have to do this. And then there's going to be the crocheters, the people who are actually crocheting these pieces, right? That could be you and me and everybody who's interested in crochet. So there we go. We have, for For example, video tutorials, that's very typical. A lot of people just take a video of themselves crocheting, right? And then you see more or less clearly, depending maybe on the quality of the video, what you have to do. But obviously, this is missing a very like the specificity of the task, right? It doesn't say exactly where to put what. You just have to watch really closely to keep up. Then we have the charts, as we just mentioned, and there's also something that they call graphs. It's not really graphs. It's not a graph at all. Actually, it's just a table. It's for a really simple subset of crochet patterns, which can actually be represented in a table. But we're not talking about those right now. They exist, but they are really only for super simple patterns. Then we also have written instructions, and those have the same issue as the video in tutorials, because everybody can write in their own way. There is no structured format, let's say, of how to actually write those texts. So basically, it's not only from language to language that it changes, but also from designer to designer. So really everybody can make up their own way of writing things down. And this obviously does not help the clarity of how to make something. So imagine you're maybe a crochet beginner, or maybe you're interested in learning how to crochet. You're really missing something that clearly specifies where you have to put it. I mean, you're all computer scientists, I suppose, and then you want to really know what you have to do. If you want to tell the computer how to do this, you're going to need to be really specific. So this is basically what I'm trying to do. Actually, I wanted to show you this slide, but well, let's continue with this. So actually, we also validated that this is a real problem, this ambiguity in the patterns. We have made a user study, and in that user study, we have talked to professional crochet designers that have been presented with this pattern. This pattern I have found from a real crochet designer just out of the internet that is actually selling or giving away this pattern. And I've asked the professional crochet designers, what do you think about this pattern? Are there any issues with it? And they all answered first time, this looks correct, looks fine, looks nice. But when you actually went through the individual steps of trying to crochet it, they started to realize the problems here highlighted in orange. So it's really like, where should you insert it into? Let's go really quickly into these. So for example, here, don't worry, you don't have to understand the symbols. Each symbol stands for a stitch, right? So you start here in the middle with this ring, and then you go outwards. You start with these, we're going to go into those, and then you go around this loop basically, and then you're going to do the final loop. So this is generally how this works. But what we do not know is how we finish one of these rounds, where we actually crochet into. So there are actual problems that the crochet designers have been able to spot only after actually crocheting and going into depth. So what we want to achieve is basically having an unambiguous representation that basically the computer can understand, can analyze, can transform into various other formats, such as, for example, the visualization, which is very much important, where we're going to be talking about for the domain experts, basically a visual language for them to understand, for the crochet designers, basically, to then edit these patterns or create these patterns for the crocheters. And then in the last step, since we are now working in the digital world and have this representation, we can out of this make any kinds of analysis. We can try to analyze whether the chart should actually be flat, or the thing that we're making is going to be flat, what shape it is going to be having, and also obviously how many stitches we're using, maybe even how much yarn or how long it's going to take. So for the representation, one quick step back of how crochet works basically. So we were saying before in the very first video is in crochet you always insert the hook into the yarn, and this is going to be the insertion point, which is then in our graph, which is the digital representation, is going to be nodes. So these nodes are going to have properties which are actually relevant only for visualization later. And these are going to represent different stitch types. I will present you in a second that there are multiple stitch types, and obviously also yarn color can be represented, and the position in the whole chart. Then the edges will represent the yarn flow, and we will have 3 different types of edges. There's going to be a previous edge, which always helps us to keep the traversability. then in insert edge, which is relevant to know where the stitch is inserting, so where we always have to insert the hook. And then there's going to be a slip stitch, but let's look at the next slide, which will hopefully make it more clear. So we have these three types of stitches. There is a chain stitch. This is a generic stitch to go into the height, basically. So this doesn't go into anything. It just generates heights. Every time you pull a loop through an existing loop and you go higher and higher and higher. So basically you're just creating height with this. And then there's another stitch. Well, there are multiple other stitches. For example, the SC stands for single crochet, then half double crochet, double crochet. Whoever knows crochet knows this. Don't worry, it's just a different type of stitch. And all these stitches have in common that they will always have a previous edge. They always come from somewhere, right? Because you never really take out the hook and start somewhere else. You always go from where you are. So you always have a previous edge. And then you will also have an insert edge. And this insert will clearly represent where you're inserting into, which will always be typically another stitch. And then there is this special use case, which is called slip stitch. And this basically, don't worry so much about it, it's just like a connection edge, because there's this kind of stitch which you use to connect one point to another. And this is called a slip stitch, where you really have a super, super small stitch that just connects one point to the next. Yeah, but this can actually be used as a previous stitch in the traversability. Yeah, I hope this makes sense so far. So this is how we're generally building up this graph. So we have these different stitch types, and now it's about how to represent general crochet techniques. And there we will have the increasing stitches and decreasing stitches. They are the most important methods, let's say, because this is important to actually shape our crochet object. So if you want to make a super simple thing, like a ball, okay, you start with a few stitches, and then you have to increase until you're at the highest point that you want to be. And then you start to decrease. And this is being represented by, for increasing, multiple stitches can go into one node, so can insert into one node, and decreasing as one stitch can insert into multiple. So by this, we're either narrowing the field where we're working or we're widening it. Then we've also added some new concepts. And one important thing here is on the left side, you see the holes. The holes are actually important because sometimes, especially when there's chain stitches, this is really about crochet, right? Because in crochet, when you try to go into a chain stitch, this is really tedious work. It's so tiny, the stitch, you don't really want to crochet into it. Usually in a chain stitch, there's a lot of space underneath. So you normally just place the hook underneath the whole stitch. So in order to represent that, because it can make actual different way of outcome when you either you go into this stitch or underneath it, this really leads into a different look in the end. So you really want to represent that, which you cannot actually at the moment with the existing chart that we saw, because you don't really have this point, like where does something crochet into. So we added an extra helper node basically for a hole, which then also has the connections to the surrounding nodes, so that we know basically what this hole references. And then later you can crochet into exactly that hole. On the other side, there's also something called placeholder nodes for partial patterns. So we have the option to create basically only one part of a pattern. This you would use for reusability, right? You're thinking like of a subset of stitches that you want to use multiple times. And you can do that in by having just this subset of stitches, but you always need to keep the connections to any of the outlying stitches there. So if you want to add a stitch that requires an insert edge, it also requires a placeholder node where it would later insert into. So if you want to include this in an existing graph, you would know which nodes had to be replaced or where this has to be filled up. We also represented further concepts, but you can maybe look it up in the paper because of time, or ask questions later. Yeah, so here, hopefully this makes it a little bit more understandable. We have here on the top left, we have how it looks in the graph. So we have all of these different nodes and edges and how they're if you can see it, actually, it's really tiny. On the edges, it says sometimes P, that stands for previous, and sometimes it says I. Those are the ones that go like towards the H, towards the whole, and that stands for insert. So basically, this is how it's represented as a graph. And then on the bottom, these two are basically how it is represented for the user. So this is like a direct mapping that the user gets, so the user being the Crochet designer. And out of this, they can design it, and then it will be able to transform into text also from there. And then the user can finally, here on the top left, top right, crochet from this pattern. All right, so we built a little demo also. We have a prototype for this, and let me just quickly present this. I'll have to put this on the other screen. Here, here we have this ball that I was talking about. So we can have it here in the 3D world, basically, and see that it actually uses the shape. So what we're doing here is we're using a force graph to render all of this and to calculate the forces between the stitches, because what's also really important is, depending on the stitch type, here actually we're using only single crochets, depending on the stitch type, the insert edge has a different length. As you can see maybe here in this actually in German, don't worry about this, but these symbols are the different stitches. And this is like the smallest stitch that you can have. And these all get a little bit longer in height. So that's basically the difference of the different stitches, why you would have the different stitches. And this has to be represented also in the visualization for the designers. So here you can see that thanks to the force graph layout also, that we can directly see that this graph translates actually to a crocheted ball in the end. So this is one of the prototypes, and I actually have a newer version, which is this one, where I wanted to show you also one more, which is the one from the example. This is the one that you already know from the example, right? So what you can see here, we have here like a helper view that shows the guidelines also. So we can see here, these stitches are connected all to the other ones. If we follow them, we can actually go basically from this stitch, it would go to this. Here we have the previous line. It would go all the way around. This dot stands for a slip stitch. So this is like this connector stitch, right? So we go all the way around, we connect, and then we can go upwards. So we have another previous. We basically always follow the previous edges. And by this, we have the traversability of the graph. Here we have the first stitch that has an insert. This stitch, basically here you have the node of the stitch, and this is the edge, which is the insert edge, goes into the hole. And this hole was defined, as you can see here, it is connected to these outer chain stitches, which are forming like the inner loop. Yeah, so basically like this, you can see what the designer sees when they're creating something, and we can also continue crocheting. You basically select up here a stitch, and you add it here. Now we just added a chain stitch. We can also select single crochet, for example. We can click directly where we want to insert. You can imagine it like digital crochet, let's say. You're actually digitally crocheting here in this editor, and you can even use the function already of, for example, we have here a function called autocomplete. We can repeat this last stitch, let's say 20 times, and then we should see it in a second that it went all the way around, because it's going all the way around here, and it's actually crocheting all into here. If we had completed the round, it would also be able to nicer layout. So going back to the presentation, yeah, so basically we made an impact study where we asked different crochet designers to what we saw before, right? Talking about the pattern and the issues in it, but also testing out the different features in the editor. And generally, the results were that they were really enjoying and seeing the benefits in the preview mode of the visualization. So you could really see what the methods were creating in the 3D view. So if you were starting a new pattern, instead of having to crochet it, you could look at it in the editor, see if it is what you want, and then already iterate within the editor. You wouldn't even have to all the time go over the work by crocheting. Also, you can see mistakes more easily because of, if you see, for example, at this star, you can see if it has symmetry or not, and then you could improve if there was something wrong. One thing that was missing maybe is more like helpful updating perspective. This is really like when you're looking at something in 3D, you really need a good perspective of what you're working, especially when it gets big, and with crochet it gets big really fast. So it's really imperative to have a better live view of exactly where you're crocheting. So there we'll still have to improve. And also the auto completion feature that I just demonstrated was really well perceived. In general, actually, I am working right now on making this usable and applying this in the real world, let's say, and building it up. You can check it out on chartcrafter.org already. There I am. I have already a platform where you can find designs that are made by the editor. So here you can see how it can look when the editor creates a pattern, and you can use it and already start to crochet from this pattern directly from the platform. So what is still missing? There's a lot of work that you can do, for example, of transforming the patterns. This thing, change the size, this is actually a huge topic. This you could imagine, like, think of a clothing item like a t-shirt, like the sizes M, L, or something like that. Changing this, if you have like a specific pattern of the size and you wanted to change it to another size, you have to do a whole lot of calculations and a whole lot of thought on how you would actually change it. It's already a lot of manual work for designers, and this could be a very interesting task to automate that. Other things like pattern analysis, obviously there we could improve the shape preview. So right now, as you saw, there were quite a lot of big distance between the individual stitches. That can definitely be improved. And for modularity, we were already talking about the partial patterns. The actual editing part of those patterns has still to be implemented, and then obviously to be able to define and reuse these components as well as still missing. Finally, as a conclusion, so we have been using this visual domain-specific language basically in order to make it more accessible to the domain experts, which are the crochet designers. And here we're really happy to see how it was perceived in the user study, as it was really, really helpful. It was not too hard because we have to really think of the crochet designers as not maybe too tech savvy, so we really have to have a super usable interface here, which we had to really reduce a lot to make it as easy as possible. And yeah, but generally we have built this foundation for digital patterns that we can now imagine to be used in a lot of contexts. So this could work if there were ever to be created a crochet machine. We can imagine that this pattern would be like the G code used for that machine. Right, you can enable a lot of analyses, like what I was already saying, like, is something flat, is something, what shape does it actually have, like real shape calculations for it. You can even check for the instructions, how long does it take, which we can actually already calculate. And yeah, obviously one thing also is that you can check the overlaps between the patterns. Yeah, so this basically is the foundation for any digital patterns to come, and we hope to be able to improve that. And yeah, if you want, you can check it out on chartcrafter.com. I hope .org, and I hope it was understandable, as maybe not all of you are in the topic of crochet. I am looking forward to your questions.
Thank you. Good. Well, that was a fascinating talk about an area I don't know anything about, but very interesting indeed. And we've got time for 2 or 3 quick questions. Good. Oh, loads of questions. Right. Go on, student volunteer. Go and try the Thank you so much.
Okay, I'll try and make this one quick. But earlier in the presentation, you talked about this one pattern that the experts at first thought it looked okay, but after trying it, found a couple of issues with it. Were you able to formalize the issues with that pattern in terms of, say, graph properties or anything of that sort?
Yes, definitely. So the issues that here, these up here, were the issue that it was not basically, there was no hole to define because these were not clearly defined as going into this hole. So basically that's where the idea of defining this whole node, this helper node basically rose from, because you could not actually represent that in the existing format.
First, right?
Hi, this is Yoshiki Oshima, and I love this work. And it's on the tradition of basically computer-aided craft and what computer and human can do together. And one sort of comment is that, yeah, along that line, it may be great if it's integrated with a augmented reality glass, and the computer can show what the next step while doing this.
Yes, definitely. This is a very interesting thought, because it's always the question of how to actually show the pattern to the crocheter while they're crocheting. Right now, a lot of people are printing their patterns, which is a little bit waste of paper, sometimes depends, no? But maybe we can find other also digital ways of making it accessible.
I guess a very closely related question. Have you thought about moving the graph editing experience to like VR or AR?
No, I have not. I think this might be a little bit of an obstacle for the actual domain experts, as they are not currently working in this domain. I think this would be a bigger step for them to go there.
Another question back.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, very interesting talk. Just one question. Can the editor suggest to someone designing a crochet what is the logical next step in the design?
So this is a thing that I'm planning for the automation, like the automatic function, the one that I was already showing. The idea is that it later can analyze the pattern that you have already started, and that it can know when the row or the round is finished, basically. So basically it knows how to automatically finish all of the stitches that you already started in the same pattern until the end of the round or row. So basically, like if you're in the code editor and you like press tab and it suggests you what you write in the rest of the line, right? So something like this I can imagine for the end of the round.
Great. Thank you, Clara.
Okay, thank you.